two wolf dog pups trembling in the deep drifts of Blackwood Ridge. Their amber eyes reflected the cold steel barrel of a hunter's rifle. The old man didn't see innocence. He saw a wild bloodline that needed to end. His finger tightened on the trigger, and the mountain held its breath. But from the mist, a stranger lunged, a man who had walked through fire, now placing his own body between the bullet and the beast's. No one knew that this moment of near violence would eventually spark a miracle that thawed an entire frozen town. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? The dawn over Blackwood Ridge didn't break. It bruised. A deep, violet light bled slowly over the jagged spine of the mountains, revealing a world held captive by ice and ancient pine. Here, the air was thin and tasted of resin and frost, a sharp, clean scent that burned the lungs if you inhaled too quickly. The wind was never truly silent up here. It prowled through the valley like a restless spirit, rattling the frozen branches and whispering through the cracks of the timber homes scattered below. It was a place where winter wasn't just a season. It was a living, breathing presence that demanded respect. High above the town, perched precariously on a granite outcrop, stood the old watchtower. Once, it had been the eyes of the Forest Service, a sentinel against the summer blazes. Now, it was a hermitage. Inside, Caleb Thorne sat by the glass wall, watching the fog roll through the valley floor like a slow, white tide. He was a man who looked as though he had been carved from the mountain itself, rough-hewn, enduring, and weathered. At 42, his dark hair was dusted with premature white, like ash settling on coal. His hands, wrapped around a tin mug of black coffee, were scarred and calloused, maps of a life spent fighting the one element that consumed everything it touched. Caleb was a smoke jumper. Or he had been. He was one of the elite few who threw themselves from plains into the heart of wildfires, armed with nothing but a Pulaski axe and a refusal to die. But that was a lifetime ago. He no longer wore the yellow Nomex shirt or the heavy boots of his trade. Instead, he wore a thick flannel jacket and the heavy silence of a man who had seen too much. He didn't watch the horizon for plumes of smoke anymore. The fires he monitored now were the ones burning inside his own head, the phantom heat that woke him at 3 a.m., the smell of charred timber that lingered when the air was perfectly clear. The interior of the tower was sparse, almost monastic. A cot, a wood stove that hummed with a low heat, and a single wooden chair. But on the far wall, illuminated by a shaft of pale morning light, hung an object that seemed out of place in the quiet room, a firefighter's axe. Its red handle was scorched black near the grip, and the steel blade was deeply chipped, a jagged scar in the metal. It wasn't a trophy, it was a penance. Caleb's eyes drifted to it as they did every morning. He didn't see the steel. He saw the memory it held. He saw the roaring inferno of the Bitterroot Complex fire 3 years ago. He heard the deafening roar that sounded like a freight train, drowning out the radio static. He felt the weight of that axe in his hands as he tried to breach a collapsed beam, behind which a family had been huddling. He remembered the heat, a physical weight that pressed against his chest, and the sickening snap of the blade chipping against stone as the roof gave way. He remembered the silence that followed. The kind of silence that screams. He took a slow sip of coffee, the bitterness grounding him. He had moved to Blackwood Ridge to escape the heat, seeking the cold anonymity of the high altitude. He thought the snow might bury the ghosts. But he learned quickly that memories don't have a temperature. They survive the freeze just as well as they survive the fire. Putting the mug down, Caleb stood up. His movements were stiff, his left knee aching with the drop in barometric pressure. Another souvenir from the job. He needed to go into town. Not because he wanted to, but because the silence in the tower was becoming loud enough to drown him. He grabbed his pack and stepped out onto the metal catwalk. The wind hit him instantly, biting at his exposed skin, but Caleb didn't flinch. He welcomed the cold. It was the only thing that felt real. The walk down the winding trail was a ritual. The snow crunched rhythmically under his boots, a steady cadence that tried to impose order on his chaotic thoughts. As he descended, the dense forest gave way to the outskirts of the town. Blackwood Ridge was a community of loggers and miners, tough people who kept their heads down and their fires stoked. They knew Caleb as the man in the tower, a figure of curiosity and caution. They saw the burns on his neck that peeked out from his collar, and they knew enough not to ask. Caleb kept his eyes on the slushy road, avoiding gazes, walking with the defensive posture of someone expecting a blow. He passed the general store, the smell of diesel and feed drifting out, and turned toward a small, warm-looking building at the end of the street. The Hearth. It was a bakery and a library combined, a strange little hybrid that smelled of yeast, old paper, and cinnamon. It was the heart of the town, and the only place Caleb felt safe enough to lower his guard, if only by an inch. He pushed the door open, a brass bell chiming softly to announce him. The warmth hit him like a physical embrace. The air was thick with the scent of rising dough and vanilla. Shelves of books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, insulating the room from the howling wind outside. Behind the counter, kneading a massive ball of dough, stood Mrs. Clara. Clara was a woman in her 70s, with sharp, intelligent eyes behind thick glasses and hands that were as deft with a bandage as they were with a rolling pin. She had been a field nurse in a war long forgotten by most, and she recognized a casualty when she saw one. She didn't look up immediately, just continued her rhythmic kneading. "You're late, Caleb," she said, her voice raspy but kind. "The coffee's been fresh for 20 minutes. It's starting to get an attitude." Caleb managed a faint, fleeting smile. It didn't reach his eyes, but it softened the hard lines of his jaw. Snow on the ridge was deep, Clara. Took longer to clear the path. He walked over to the section of the library he frequented, the history corner. He liked reading about the past. It was fixed, immutable, unlike the future, which felt like a threat, or the present, which felt like a struggle. He pulled a thick volume about the early settlers of the region from the shelf. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and poured a mug of coffee, setting it on the small table near the fireplace where Caleb usually sat. She walked over, her limp barely noticeable, and placed a fresh cinnamon roll beside it. "You look tired," she observed, not as a question, but as a diagnosis. She looked at him with that piercing gaze that seemed to peel back the layers of his flannel jacket and see the trembling man underneath. "Wind kept me up," Caleb lied. He sat down, his large frame making the wooden chair look fragile. He opened the book, staring at the text without reading it. "The wind doesn't cause those dark circles, Caleb," Clara said softly, resting a hand on the back of the chair opposite him. "It's what you hear in the wind." Caleb stiffened. He gripped the edge of the book, his knuckles turning white. Clara was the only one who dared to push him, perhaps because she had seen men like him before, soldiers who came back with all their limbs but none of their spirit. "I'm fine, Clara," he said, his voice low, a warning rumble. "You're surviving," she corrected gently. "There's a difference between breathing and living. You're up in that tower guarding against a fire that went out 3 years ago." Caleb looked up then, his eyes flashing with a sudden, raw pain. "It didn't go out," he whispered, the sound barely audible over the crackle of the fireplace. "I can still smell it." Clara didn't offer empty platitudes. She didn't say, "It wasn't your fault," or "Time heals all wounds." She knew those words were useless against the kind of ghosts Caleb carried. Instead, she tapped the cover of the book under his hand. "Read," she said simply. "Sometimes the only way to quiet the noise in your head is to let someone else's voice in for a while." She squeezed his shoulder briefly, a touch of maternal warmth that Caleb wanted to lean into but didn't know how, and went back to her dough. Caleb watched her go, then turned his gaze to the fire in the hearth. It was contained, controlled behind the iron grate. Safe. But as he stared into the orange embers for a split second, the smell of cinnamon vanished, replaced by the acrid stench of burning pine and melting rubber. He blinked rapidly, forcing the memory back into its cage, and focused on the ink on the page. He was a man on the run, standing still, a guardian with nothing left to protect. And as the wind outside picked up, howling like a lost child, Caleb Thorne realized he was waiting. He didn't know what for. Maybe for the snow to bury him completely, or maybe, just maybe, for a reason to pick up the axe again. The wind on Blackwood Ridge didn't just blow, it screamed. It was a sound that tore through the pines and rattled the bones, a reminder that on this mountain, mercy was a foreign language. But in the middle of that howling white void, the silence between two men was louder than the storm. Silas Vane stood like a gnarled root twisted by years of frost. His hunting rifle was leveled, steady as stone, the barrel aimed at the snowdrift where two huddled shapes lay. To anyone else, they looked like puppies. Matted fur, trembling limbs, eyes wide with terror. But Silas didn't see puppies. He saw the slope of their snouts, the breadth of their paws, the amber glint in their eyes that belonged to the deep, dark woods. He saw wolves. He saw the killers that had taken everything from him. "Step aside, Thorne," Silas growled, his voice rougher than the gravel beneath the snow. "You don't know what you're looking at." Caleb Thorne didn't move. He stood directly in the line of fire, his chest heaving, his breath clouding in the freezing air. He wasn't wearing his turnout gear, but he stood with the grounded stance of a man used to holding the line against a wall of flame. "I'm looking at two freezing animals, Silas," Caleb said, his voice low but cutting through the wind. "Put the gun down." "They ain't animals. They're monsters in the making," Silas spat, his finger twitching near the trigger guard. "Hybrids. Wolf blood. You let 'em live, and by next winter they'll be tearing the throat out of a deer. Or a child. I'm doing the town a favor." The mention of a child hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Everyone in Blackwood Ridge knew the story, though no one spoke it aloud. 10 years ago, the storm had taken Silas's granddaughter. He blamed the cold, he blamed the mountain, but most of all, he blamed the wild things that roamed it, the creatures that survived when his kin did not. Caleb took a step forward. It was a dangerous move. Silas was a man whose grief had calcified into rage, and a gun in the hands of a grieving man is a volatile thing. "They aren't hurting anyone," Caleb said, his eyes locking onto the older man's face. "Look at them. They're starving." "That's how it starts," Silas countered, his eyes narrowing. "Hunger turns to hunting. You of all people should know, Thorne. You can't tame a wildfire. You put it out before it spreads." Caleb flinched. The metaphor struck deep, vibrating against the scars of his own past. He knew the destruction of fire better than anyone. He knew what it felt like to be powerless against a force of nature. But looking down at the two shivering creatures, one black as soot, the other gray as ash, he didn't see a threat. He saw survivors. He saw lives clinging to existence in a world that wanted them dead. "I'm not letting you shoot them," Caleb said, the finality in his tone echoing like a gavel strike. He reached out, not for the gun, but for the space between them, a gesture of de-escalation that he had used 100 times on panic-stricken victims. "Go home, Silas. The storm is getting worse." Silas held his aim for a heartbeat longer, the internal struggle playing out on his weathered face. He looked at Caleb, then at the dogs, and back to Caleb. He saw the stubbornness in the ex-firefighter's jaw, a resolve forged in heat that the cold couldn't crack. Slowly, agonizingly, Silas lowered the rifle. He didn't engage the safety. "You're a fool," Silas muttered, slinging the weapon over his shoulder. The leather strap creaked, sounding like an old door closing. "You think you're saving them? You're just bringing the devil into your house. Mark my words, Caleb. The mountain doesn't forgive weakness, and neither do I." He turned, his heavy boots crunching violently into the snow, and walked away into the whiteout. He didn't look back. He disappeared like a ghost, swallowed by the very element he hated. Caleb let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. His knees felt weak, the adrenaline crash hitting him all at once. He turned to the snowbank. The two puppies were pressed so tightly together they looked like a single organism. The larger one, the black male, let out a low, guttural growl. A tiny, pathetic sound that tried to be brave. The smaller gray female just shivered, her head buried in her brother's flank. "It's okay," Caleb whispered, crouching down. His voice, usually gruff from years of shouting over roaring engines, softened into something unrecognizable. "He's gone." He pulled off his thick gloves, needing to feel them to check for warmth. As his bare hand reached out, the black pup snapped, teeth clicking inches from Caleb's fingers. It was a flash of the wild blood Silas had warned about. But Caleb didn't pull away. He held his hand steady, palm open, offering no threat. "I know," he murmured. "I know you're scared. I'd bite me too." Slowly, the growl died in the pup's throat, replaced by a whimper of exhaustion. Caleb moved fast then. He unzipped his heavy flannel jacket and scooped them up, pressing their icy bodies against the wool of his sweater. They were lighter than they looked, just skin, bone, and shivering fear. He carried them to his truck, an old rusted pickup that had survived more winters than most of the town's residents. He placed them on the passenger seat, wrapping them in an oil-stained blanket he kept for emergencies. They didn't move. They just stared at him with those amber eyes, ancient, knowing, and utterly misplaced in such fragile bodies. The drive up to the old watchtower was a battle. The tires fought for grip on the icy switchbacks, the engine groaning in protest. Inside the cab, the smell of wet fur and old dust filled the air. Caleb glanced over at them every few seconds as if expecting them to vanish, or to turn into the monsters Silas had described. But they just slept, the heat of the vents lulling them into a coma of relief. When they finally reached the summit, the world below was gone, erased by the clouds. The watchtower stood solitary against the gray sky, a steel and glass box on stilts. It was a place designed for watching, not for living. Caleb carried the bundle up the metal stairs, the wind trying to tear them from his arms. He kicked the door open and sealed it shut behind him, engaging the heavy deadbolt. Silence returned, but it was different now. He laid them down near the wood stove. The fire was dying, just glowing embers behind the grate. Caleb knelt and fed it a piece of dried pine. The wood caught instantly, crackling and popping, sending a wave of orange light across the floorboards. The puppies stirred. The warmth seemed to revive them. The gray female, Shadow, he decided to call her for she moved like smoke, lifted her head and looked around. The black male, Echo, stood up on wobbly legs and shook himself, sending a spray of melted snow across the floor. Caleb sat back on his heels, watching them. He felt a strange tightness in his chest, a pressure behind his eyes. He had spent 3 years pushing the world away, building a fortress of solitude up here where no one could get hurt, where he couldn't fail anyone ever again. And now, he had brought 2 lives into his sanctuary. "What have I done?" he whispered to the empty room. He looked at the axe on the wall. The chipped blade seemed to mock him in the firelight. "You couldn't save the ones who mattered," it seemed to say. "What makes you think you can save these?" Echo trotted over, his claws clicking on the wood. He sniffed Caleb's boot, then looked up. For a moment, man and beast locked eyes. In that gaze, Caleb didn't see a killer. He saw a question. "Are we safe?" Caleb reached out and awkwardly patted the pup's head. The fur was coarse, wild, but beneath it the skin was warm. "I don't know," Caleb answered the unspoken question, "but you're not out in the cold anymore." Outside, the storm raged on, burying the road, burying the tracks, sealing them in. On one side of the valley, an old hunter sat cleaning his gun, nursing a hatred that kept him warm. On the other, a broken firefighter sat by a stove, guarding 2 creatures he didn't understand. The lines were drawn. The fire was lit. And on Blackwood Ridge, nothing stayed buried forever. The silence of the watchtower, once Caleb's only companion, had been utterly destroyed. In its place was the chaos of life. Echo and Shadow were not house pets. They were raw nature wrapped in fur, their veins humming with the wild blood Silas despised. They did not understand the rules of men. They chewed the legs of the wooden cot until it wobbled. They overturned the ash bucket, tracking soot across the floorboards like war paint. They wrestled with a ferocity that made the metal walls ring. Caleb spent his days cleaning, his nights pacing, his patience worn as thin as the mountain air. He was a man used to order, to the strict discipline of the fire line, and this untamed energy left him exhausted. But the true test came with the wind. It happened on a Tuesday night. The wind didn't just blow, it roared through the valley gaps, a low, guttural thrum that sounded terrifyingly like a backdraft. To Caleb's shattered nerves, it was the sound of oxygen being sucked into an inferno. He woke, gasping, his chest crushed by an invisible weight. The room was dark and cold, but his skin was slick with sweat. He could smell it again. The burning pine, the melting rubber. He curled into himself on the floor, his hands clawing at his hair, the old firefighter's instinct to tuck and cover taking over. He was drowning in a memory of fire. Then a weight settled on his chest. Not the crushing weight of guilt, but something solid, heavy, and warm. It was Echo. The black pup didn't whine or pace. He simply climbed onto Caleb's heaving torso and laid his heavy head over the man's racing heart. He became a living anchor in the storm. Beside him, Shadow nudged Caleb's trembling hand, her rough tongue lapping at his clenched fingers, grounding him in the present. They didn't judge the fear. They didn't ask him to be strong. They simply offered their warmth against his cold. Mrs. Clara saw the change before Caleb did. She climbed the metal stairs 2 days later, breathless but determined, carrying a basket of herbal salve and fresh books. She found Caleb not staring at the horizon, but on the floor, asleep, with 2 growing predators curled around him like a protective rune. When he woke, startled and embarrassed, she waved him off, setting her basket on the table. She watched him check Echo's paws for ice cuts, his movements gentle, focused, entirely absent of the tremors that usually plagued him. "You think you're saving them, Caleb?" she asked softly, her voice blending with the crackle of the stove. Caleb looked up, confused. "They needed help?" "No," Clara said, opening a jar of ointment that smelled of lavender and earth. "You needed the chemistry." She explained it not as a librarian, but with the sharp precision of the field nurse she once was. She spoke of the brain's ancient wiring, how a man trapped in the trauma of war or fire is stuck in a loop of fight or flight, his veins awash in cortisol, a poison that slowly eats the soul. It keeps the muscles tight, the eyes darting, the heart ready to explode. "But the brain can't be afraid and loving at the same time," she told him, watching Shadow rest her chin on his knee. "When you tend to them, when you protect something vulnerable, you switch systems. You move to tend and befriend. Oxytocin floods the blood. It is the biological antidote to terror. You aren't just feeding dogs, Caleb. You are rewiring the parts of you that the fire burned out." Caleb looked down at his hands that had failed to save a family, now successfully soothing a restless animal. The panic wasn't gone, but the volume had been turned down. The noise in his head had been replaced by the rhythmic breathing of the creatures at his feet. For the first time in 3 years, the corners of his mouth lifted. It wasn't a laugh, and it wasn't joy, not yet, but it was a start, a crack in the ice where the light could finally get in. He scratched Echo behind the ears, and the dog leaned into his touch. 2 survivors learning that the only way to survive the cold was to share the warmth. As the winter deepened, turning the pines into statues of white marble, the old watchtower underwent a transformation. It was no longer just a steel box rattling in the wind. It had become a fortress of life. Echo grew broad-chested and fierce, his black fur thickening against the chill, while Shadow remained lithe and watchful, a silent ghost moving through the rooms. They were no longer the trembling creatures Caleb had pulled from the snowbank. They were becoming the guardians of the mountain, and in turn, Caleb was becoming whole. He didn't notice the tremors in his hands as much anymore. The nightmares that used to smell of smoke were replaced by the heavy, comforting scent of wet fur and wood smoke. He laughed more in a month than he had in 3 years, the sound rusty but real, echoing off the glass walls as Echo clumsily tried to catch snowflakes on his tongue. But peace is a fragile thing when it is being watched. Across the ravine, hidden in the dense tree line, the glint of sunlight on glass betrayed a presence. Silas Vane stood knee-deep in the drift, his binoculars pressed to his eyes, his knuckles white against the black casing. He wasn't watching a neighbor, he was watching a ticking time bomb. Every time he saw those dogs run, he didn't see playfulness. He saw the predator. He saw the inevitable betrayal. To the people of Blackwood Ridge, Silas was just a bitter old man who hated the cold. They whispered that his heart had frozen over long ago. But they were wrong. Silas didn't hate the cold because he was cruel. He hated it because he remembered exactly how it felt to lose a war against it. 10 years ago, the mountain hadn't been this quiet. It had been screaming. It was a storm, much like this one, a whiteout that erased the world in minutes. Silas had been younger then, stronger, but nature doesn't care about strength. His granddaughter, Lily, 7 years old with hair the color of summer wheat, had wandered too far from the cabin. Silas had gone out with his best hunting dog, a prize-winning hound named Buster, to find her. He remembered the panic that tasted like copper in his mouth. He remembered screaming her name until his throat bled, and he remembered the moment the dog stopped. The hound, bred for loyalty, bred for the hunt, had looked into the swirling white death of the storm, looked back at Silas, and then turned tail. The animal chose survival. It ran back to the warmth of the truck, leaving Silas alone in the dark. He found Lily 2 days later when the snow melted. She was curled up under a spruce tree, looking like she was just asleep. The silence of that morning broke something inside Silas that never healed. He stared through the binoculars now, his jaw set like granite. He hated the wild because it had no mercy. He hated the dogs because, when the chips were down, their instinct was to survive, not to save. In his mind, Echo and Shadow were just waiting for the right moment to turn on Caleb, to choose their own blood over his. He wasn't hunting them for sport. He was hunting them to kill the memory of his own failure, to kill the reminder that in the face of the mountain, love wasn't enough. "You're a fool, Thorne," Silas whispered to the wind, lowering the binoculars. "They'll leave you when the fire comes, just like they always do." Unaware of the eyes upon him, Caleb sat on the deck of the watchtower, watching the sun dip below the jagged peaks. The sky was a bruised purple, bleeding into the coming night. Echo sat on his haunches, staring at the horizon with a regal intensity, while Shadow rested her head on Caleb's boot, her breathing slow and rhythmic. Caleb reached down, burying his fingers in Shadow's thick ruff. He thought about what Mrs. Clara had said about angels. He wasn't a religious man. Fire had burned most of his faith away years ago, but looking at them now, he felt a strange, vibrating truth settle in his chest. We spend our lives looking for miracles in the sky, expecting thunder and lightning to announce that we are saved. But perhaps grace is quieter than that. Perhaps it arrives muddy and starving on a frozen road. He realized that Echo and Shadow weren't just animals he had rescued. They were a test, a mirror held up to the town of Blackwood Ridge. For Silas, they reflected fear and a past that wouldn't die. But for Caleb, they reflected a future he was terrified to hope for. "You aren't just dogs, are you?" Caleb murmured, the steam from his breath drifting into the twilight. Echo turned his head, his amber eyes catching the last light of the sun. He didn't bark. He just looked at Caleb with an ancient, knowing weight, as if to say, "We are whatever you need us to be." Caleb leaned back, the cold air stinging his face, but for the first time, he didn't feel the need to retreat inside. He sat in the growing dark, guarded by two souls he had pulled from the edge of death, unaware that the true test of their loyalty was gathering on the horizon, darker and hotter than any storm. Grace had arrived, but fire was coming to see if it would hold. The storm didn't arrive. It attacked. Night fell over Blackwood Ridge, not with the gradual dimming of light, but with the sudden, violent slam of a heavy door. The blizzard, which the weathermen had called a severe winter system, was, in the language of the mountain, a reckoning. The wind screamed at 70 miles an hour, a white hurricane that stripped the bark from the trees and turned the air into a suffocating curtain of ice. Inside the old watchtower, the metal walls groaned under the assault, the rivets popped and hissed like dying embers. Caleb sat by the stove, his hand resting on Echo's neck. The dog was pacing, a low whine vibrating in his throat. Shadow was under the cot, pressed flat against the floorboards. Animals always know first. They feel the vibration of disaster in the marrow of their bones long before the sky falls. Caleb stood up to check the window, but there was nothing to see. The world outside had been erased. There was no horizon, no tree line, no ground. Just a swirling vortex of white darkness. Then the sound changed. It wasn't the wind anymore. It was a crack, sharp, deafening like a gunshot amplified by a cathedral. The ancient ponderosa pine that stood guard beside the tower, burdened by centuries of age and tons of ice, finally surrendered. It didn't fall gracefully. It sheared through the night, a wooden leviathan crashing down upon the steel structure. The impact threw Caleb across the room. The world tilted violently sideways. Glass shattered, spraying the room with diamond-sharp shrapnel. The roof buckled, and a massive branch, thick as a man's waist, punched through the ceiling, driving Caleb into the floor and pinning his legs beneath a tangle of steel and timber. Darkness swallowed him. For a moment, there was only the ringing in his ears and the cold bite of snow blowing in through the shattered wall. Then came the smell. It started as the scent of ozone, the smell of severed wires sparking in the dark. Then the smell of old paper. Then the terrified, acrid scent of burning wool. The wood stove had overturned. The coals, spilled across the dry floorboards, found the scattered books, the old blankets, the very structure of the tower itself. Fire. It bloomed with terrifying speed, fed by the howling wind that rushed in through the broken window. It was a blacksmith's bellows, fanning the spark into an inferno in seconds. Caleb tried to move, but his legs were dead weight. Pain, white-hot and jagged, shot up his spine, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the psychological terror that seized him. The smoke curled around him, thick and gray, and suddenly he wasn't in Blackwood Ridge anymore. He was back in the Bitterroot. He was back in the furnace. His throat closed. His vision tunneled. The PTSD that he had kept at bay with routine and solitude came roaring back, paralyzing him more effectively than the timber across his legs. He watched the flames lick up the walls, mesmerizing and lethal. He stopped fighting. He closed his eyes and waited for the heat to take him, just as he had always feared it would. This is it, he thought, a strange calm settling over him. The fire finally caught up, but down in the tree line, someone was watching. Silas Vane had been out in the storm, tracking. He told himself he was checking his trap lines, but in truth, he was hunting for a reason. He had seen the lights of the tower flicker and die. He had heard the crash of the tree, a sound that shook the snow from the branches around him. He stood in the waist-deep drift, squinting against the stinging wind. Through the breaks, in the whiteout, he saw it. An orange glow, small at first, then growing, pulsing like a heartbeat against the dark sky. Fire. Silas hated fire almost as much as he hated the cold. Fire was chaos. It was hungry. But as he watched the flames begin to consume the watchtower, a dark thought whispered in the back of his mind. Fate, the voice said. The mountain is cleaning itself." He took a step back. He turned his shoulder to the wind, ready to walk away. The man in that tower was an intruder. The beasts he harbored were dangerous. If nature decided to claim them, who was Silas to interfere? It was a cruel logic, but grief had made Silas a cruel man. He adjusted his rifle strap, preparing to leave them to the ash. Then he saw movement. It was a flicker of shadow against the orange light, framed in the shattered window of the burning tower. Silas raised his binoculars, his hands trembling slightly from the cold. It was the female. Shadow. The gray wolf dog was not running. The door had been blown open by the impact. The path to freedom was clear. Any wild animal, any creature governed by the instinct of self-preservation, would have bolted into the night. That was the law of the wild. That was what the hound had done to him 10 years ago when his granddaughter was lost. But Shadow wasn't running. She was digging. Through the lens, Silas saw the animal frantic, her paws tearing at the debris. She was biting at something on the floor, a sleeve. She was pulling, her paws slipping on the slick wood, her body low to the ground to avoid the smoke. The fire was close now, the heat intense enough that Silas could imagine the smell of singing fur. Shadow threw her head back and let out a howl. Not a sound of aggression, but a cry of pure, desperate anguish. Then she dove back into the smoke, grabbing the arm of the unconscious man, trying to drag a weight 10 times her own. Silas froze. The image shattered him. 10 years of hatred, built on the foundation that animals were soulless cowards, cracked down the middle. He was watching a monster choose certain death over life without its master. He was watching a beast show a loyalty that exceeded that of any man he had ever known. And suddenly, the face in the fire wasn't Caleb's. It was Lily's. "She's not leaving him," Silas whispered, the tuo-diu wind tearing the words from his mouth. "She's not leaving him." The rifle slipped from his shoulder and fell into the snow. Silas didn't notice. He was already moving. He ran. He ran with a speed his old legs shouldn't have possessed, powered by a decade of regret. He scrambled up the icy slope, his lungs burning, his eyes fixed on the silhouette of the dog in the flames. "Not this time," he screamed in his head. "Not again." He reached the base of the tower. The metal stairs were twisted, glowing red-hot in places. Silas didn't care. He hauled himself up, the heat searing his eyebrows, the smoke blinding him. He kicked the jammed door, the wood splintering inward. The heat inside was a physical blow, a wall of force. "Get out!" Silas roared, coughing violently. "Get out, you stupid beast!" He lunged through the smoke. He grabbed Shadow by the scruff of her neck. She snarled, snapping at him, thrashing to get back to Caleb. Her coat was smoking, the gray fur singed black on one side. "I've got him!" Silas yelled at the dog, his voice breaking. "I've got him, damn you!" He threw the dog toward the door, forcing her out into the cold air. Then he turned to the pile of debris. Caleb was pale, his eyes open but unseeing, lost in the 1,000-yard stare of shock. Silas grabbed the timber pinning his legs. He gritted his teeth, summoning every ounce of strength in his weathered frame, and heaved. The wood groaned and shifted just an inch. Enough. Silas grabbed Caleb's collar. "Move, Thorne, unless you want to burn." The voice, harsh, familiar, and real, cut through Caleb's hallucination. He blinked, the vision of the bitterroot fading, replaced by the terrified, soot-streaked face of his enemy. Caleb scrambled backward, adrenaline overriding the pain in his legs. Silas pulled him, dragging him across the floorboards as the ceiling groaned above them. They tumbled out of the doorway and onto the metal grate of the catwalk just as the roof collapsed inward with a roar of sparks. They fell down the twisted stairs, hitting the snow hard. The cold was a shock, instantaneous and brutal. They rolled away from the heat, gasping for air, the snow hissing as it melted against their fevered skin. Caleb lay on his back, staring up at the burning tower. It looked like a torch held against the night sky. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. Then, A wet nose pressed against his cheek. Shadow. She was limping, her side burned, her whiskers gone. But she was there. She licked the soot from his face, whining softly. Echo appeared a second later, emerging from the darkness where he had been circling, barking frantically. He threw himself onto Caleb, his heavy paws grounding the man in the snow. Caleb wrapped his arms around them, burying his face in their fur, sobbing. Great, heaving breaths that expelled the smoke and the fear. A shadow fell over him. Caleb looked up. Silas stood there, silhouetted against the inferno of the watchtower. The old man was hunched over, hands on his knees, coughing up black phlegm. He looked at the dogs. Then he looked at Caleb. There was no hatred in his eyes anymore. The fire had burned it out. There was only exhaustion and a strange, dazed recognition. Silas slowly reached out a trembling hand. He didn't reach for Caleb. He reached for Shadow. The dog flinched, then held her ground. Silas touched the singed fur on her shoulder, his fingers gentle, reverent. She stayed, Silas whispered, his voice cracking like dry wood. She didn't run. Caleb pulled himself up to a sitting position, wincing as his leg throbbed. "I told you," he rasped, the smoke scarring his throat. "They aren't monsters, Silas." Silas looked at the burning wreckage of the home Caleb had built, then back at the wild animals that were currently licking the tears from a grown man's face. The old hunter wiped his own eyes, leaving a streak of soot across his cheek. "No," Silas said, the word heavy with admission. "I guess I was the only monster on this mountain tonight." He reached down and offered a hand to Caleb. It was a rough hand, calloused and stained, but for the first time, it wasn't a fist. "Come on, Firefighter," Silas grunted. "My truck is down the ridge, it's warm." Behind them, the watchtower burned, consuming the past, consuming the isolation. But in the light of the flames, 4 figures walked down the mountain together. The blizzard howled around them, but it didn't matter. The ice had finally broken. The following morning, the sun rose over Blackwood Ridge, but it brought no warmth. The sky was a hard, pale blue, the kind that promised nothing but ice. Down in the valley, the old watchtower was gone, reduced to a blackened skeleton of twisted steel and ash that smeared the pristine white snow like a bruise. But the real reckoning wasn't happening on the mountain. It was happening in town. The hearth, usually a sanctuary of yeast and soft conversation, had been transformed into a courtroom. The tables had been pushed aside, the chairs arranged in concentric circles. The air didn't smell of cinnamon rolls today. It smelled of wet wool, stale coffee, and judgment. The town council sat near the fireplace, their faces grim. In the center of the room sat Silas Vane. He looked smaller without his heavy coat, his shoulders hunched, his hands clasping and unclasping on his knees. He didn't look at the crowd. He stared at the floorboards, waiting for the axe to fall. "We can't ignore the pattern," Mayor Higgins said, his voice tight. He was a man who liked order, and Silas was a chaotic element. First, the threats. Then, the discharge of a firearm near the town limits. Now, a fire that could have spread to the timber reserve. Silas Vane is a liability. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room like a cold draft. The people of Blackwood Ridge were practical. They understood survival, and in their eyes, survival meant cutting off the limb that was rotting. "We propose an eviction order," Higgins continued, avoiding Silas's gaze. "He is to be barred from the township and the surrounding ridge. He can take his truck and go south, but he can't stay here." Silas didn't argue. He didn't lift his head. He had spent 10 years pushing this town away. He couldn't blame them for finally pushing back. He nodded slowly, a gesture of defeat that looked painfully like acceptance. The mayor raised his gavel, a heavy wooden mallet that seemed absurdly small compared to the lives it was about to shatter. "If there are no objections—" "I object." The voice was rough, scarred by smoke, and it stopped the gavel in midair. The heavy oak door creaked open. Caleb Thorne stood there, leaning heavily on the doorframe. He looked like a specter rising from the grave. The left side of his face was covered in thick white gauze. His flannel shirt was torn, revealing burns on his neck. He smelled of smoke and medicine. But it wasn't his appearance that silenced the room. It was what he held in his right hand, the firefighter's axe. The red handle was scorched, the blade chipped and dull, but Caleb gripped it with a strength that belied his injuries. He limped into the room, the sound of his boots heavy on the wood. The crowd parted for him, shrinking away from the raw evidence of the previous night's violence. Caleb didn't look at the mayor. He walked straight to Silas. "Caleb," Mrs. Clara whispered from the front row, half rising from her chair. "You should be in the hospital." "I'm where I need to be," Caleb rasped. He stopped in front of the old hunter. Silas looked up, his eyes wide, reflecting a mixture of shame and confusion. Caleb turned to face the council. "You want to send him away? You want to put him in a cage, or drive him to the city, or just push him somewhere where you don't have to look at him?" "He's dangerous, Caleb," the mayor insisted, though his voice wavered. "He almost got you killed." "No," Caleb said, his voice gaining strength. "The fire almost got me killed. The mountain almost got me killed. This man," he gestured to Silas, "this man walked into hell to pull me out." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of his neighbors. "You talk about justice like it's a math problem. You think if you subtract the broken pieces, the town becomes whole again. But that's not how it works. That is how you make monsters." Caleb took a breath, wincing as his ribs expanded. He spoke now with the authority of a man who had seen what happens when things are left to burn. "There are two kinds of justice," he said quietly. "There is the kind that punishes, the kind that puts walls around a man until he forgets he's human. That's what Silas has been doing to himself for 10 years, a prison of his own making. If you banish him now, you just add more bars to that cage. You create a wolf that has no pack, and that wolf will starve, and it will bite." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Then there is the justice that heals, restorative justice. It doesn't ask, how do we punish? It asks, how do we fix what is broken? You don't fix a man by throwing him away. You fix him by giving him a reason to stay." The room was so quiet you could hear the fire crackling in the hearth. Caleb turned back to Silas. The old man was trembling now, tears cutting tracks through the soot that still stained his cheeks. Caleb shifted his grip on the axe. He held it out, handle first, toward Silas. "This axe," Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion. "I carried it for 3 years. It was a symbol of the day I failed. I looked at it every morning and remembered the lives I couldn't save. It was my burden." Silas stared at the tool. It was heavy, scarred, and ugly. "But last night," Caleb continued, "you saved 2 dogs that you swore you hated, and you dragged me out of a collapsing tower. You did what I couldn't do 3 years ago. You didn't just save my life, Silas. You saved my soul." Caleb pressed the axe into Silas's shaking hands. "Take it," Caleb commanded gently. "I don't need to carry the past anymore, and neither do you. Use these hands to build something. Help me rebuild the tower, not as a fortress to keep people out, but as a beacon to bring them in." Silas gripped the handle. His fingers, calloused from years of holding a rifle, a weapon of death, curled around the wood. He looked at the chipped blade, then up at Caleb's bandaged face. Silas tried to speak, but the words fractured. "I'm just an old fool, Caleb." "No," Caleb smiled, and the bandage on his cheek pulled tight. "You're a firefighter now." The dam broke. Silas Vane, the man who had let his heart freeze over a decade ago, lowered his head and wept. It wasn't a quiet cry. It was the heaving, jagged sobbing of a man releasing a lifetime of winter. Mrs. Clara stood up and walked over, placing a hand on Silas's shoulder. Then the baker did the same. Then the mayor, slowly, stepped down and nodded. The verdict wasn't read aloud. It didn't need to be. The papers regarding the eviction were left on the table, unsigned. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. The clouds broke apart, revealing a patch of brilliant, piercing blue. The storm was over, and inside the hearth, for the first time in a long time, the fire warmed everyone equally. The wolf had been invited back into the circle, and the darkness, having no place left to hide, simply faded away. Spring didn't just arrive on Blackwood Ridge, it reclaimed it. The ice that had choked the mountain for so long finally surrendered, weeping into rivers that sparkled under a forgiving sun. The gray timber was replaced by the vibrant green of new pine, and the scent of resin was no longer sharp and cold, but sweet and alive. High on the summit, the old watchtower stood tall against the blue sky. It had been rebuilt, the blackened steel replaced by warm cedar, the shattered glass swapped for wide, welcoming windows. Above the door, a new sign swung gently in the breeze, carved by a steady hand. Blackwood Rescue and Rehabilitation Center. It wasn't a fortress anymore. It was a lighthouse for the lost. On the front porch, Silas Vane sat on the wooden steps, a grooming brush in his hand. He worked the thick winter undercoat off Echo's back with a patience that would have seemed impossible a year ago. The great black dog leaned into the old man's knee, eyes half closed in bliss. Silas murmured to him, a low, running commentary about the wind direction and the deer tracks they had seen that morning. Silas was no longer the ghost of the ridge. He was its guardian. When hikers strayed off the path, or when a child wandered too far into the woods, the town didn't call the police. They called Silas. The very skills that once made him a terrifying hunter now made him the mountain's greatest savior. He found the lost because he knew, better than anyone, exactly what it felt like to be left behind. Inside the tower, the wood stove was cold, serving only as a shelf for Mrs. Clara's tea service. Caleb sat in the armchair, a book open on his lap, but he wasn't reading. He was watching the scene outside through the glass. The burns on his neck had faded to silver scars, maps of a battle he had won. Beside him, Shadow lay stretched out in a sunbeam, her paws twitching in a dream of chasing rabbits. Caleb reached down, resting his hand on her flank. He didn't feel the phantom heat of the fire anymore. He felt a heartbeat. Steady, strong, real. "You were right," Caleb said softly, turning to Clara, who was knitting in the opposite chair. "About the chemistry." Clara smiled, her eyes crinkling behind her glasses. "It wasn't just chemistry, Caleb. It was grace." And looking at them, the hunter who learned to heal, the firefighter who learned to stop burning, and the wild dogs who taught them both how to be human, it was hard to argue otherwise. We often think of redemption as a grand, thundering event. We wait for the sky to part. But on Blackwood Ridge, redemption came quietly. It came on 4 paws in a snowstorm. It came with the swing of an axe that chose to build instead of break. It came when 2 broken men realized that the only way to fix themselves was to fix each other. They started with ashes. But ashes, as any gardener knows, are the best thing to help a garden grow. From the charred remains of hatred and grief, a new life had bloomed, rooted in the only soil that matters: compassion. If this story reminded you that no winter lasts forever and that no soul is too frozen to thaw, please share it with someone who might be walking through their own storm right now. Leave a comment below, and tonight, say a prayer for the lost, the lonely, and the broken. Pray that they find their way to a watchtower of their own, and that they find the courage to let the light back in. May God bless you, keep you, and guide you home.